Welcome to our second lecture of the week. This is the lecture for Wednesday, February 10th, 2021, and we will continue our discussion of the New South and Jim Crow segregation. We discussed that at length in Monday's lecture, and I discussed how white politicians in the South worked to disenfranchise African American men, to purge them from the voting rolls, which resulted in complete political supremacy, if you will, complete political takeover of the state and federal elected offices, as well as county and municipal offices throughout the southern states, and the Jim Crow segregation laws that resulted from that more or less created separate facilities, public facilities, in just about every aspect of public life during this time period. And we will continue with that discussion today. Before I go any further, I want to tell you that the first topic that I'll lecture on today is lynching and the horrific nature of lynching in the South from the 1880s through the first half of the 20th century. I do have a picture on the first slide of a group of a large crowd of white Southerners, I should say, at a lynching. They attended a lynching that in the picture appears to have been a postcard, which was common, that those types of photographs would be used as postcards that were sent by white Southerners during the day. But I just wanted to give you a heads up in advance because it is a graphic image, and if I know that some of you might be sensitive to it, I felt like I needed to include it to sort of give you an idea of just how widespread white Southerners accepted lynching and everything that went along with lynching during this time. Also, before we move into that topic, I want to remind you of your first primary source analysis assignment. It's due Thursday of next week. That's Thursday, February 18th. I sent out an email explaining this earlier today, along with, as an attachment to that email, I included the specific details that you need to follow in the course of that assignment, including the primary sources that you need to read and analyze. That is also posted in the content section of Blackboard. So if you haven't already seen that or viewed that, you can access it through your email or through Blackboard. And without further ado, let's continue our discussion of segregation and Jim Crow laws and how it affected African American life in the South during the 1890s and in the early decades of the 20th century. We discussed the disenfranchisement of African American men and the passage of the numerous Jim Crow laws that occurred in the 1890s in Monday's lecture, but with those laws in effect removed African American men from political participation and really made the South a one-party region politically. It was the party of the Southern Democrats. If you remember from our Reconstruction discussions earlier this semester, the Republican Party was the party that pushed for Reconstruction and specifically for the passage of the 1866 Civil Rights Act, as well as the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments that abolished slavery, established the constitutionality of the Civil Rights Act of 1866, and provided suffrage, otherwise known as the right to vote, for African American men. And in return, the Republican Party became very powerful in the South during the late 1860s, 1870s, and into the early part of the 1880s, as African American men voted predominantly Republican during this time period. But now the conservative party, the Southern Democrat Party, that were the same party that pushed for secession before the Civil War and the establishment of the Confederacy, that party is now back in power. And one thing to note, we'll get into this more as the semester moves on, but there is a tremendous difference between the Southern Democrat Party of the second half of the 19th century and the current Democratic Party of the late 20th century and into the 21st century. Just likewise, there's a major difference between the Republican Party of the 19th century and the Republican Party of contemporary America. We'll discuss that in much more detail in the middle decade, as we examine the middle decades of the 20th century. But I know that there's some misconceptions there with regards to how we label and compare today's politicians in both parties to their 19th century counterparts. So I just kind of wanted to just mention that as an aside. And now that that's out of the way, I want to talk a little bit more about Jim Crow and the color line during this time period, and beyond just the legal legislation that was passed that prohibited African Americans in the South from sharing the same railroad car or entering through the same entrance at a public restaurant or drinking out of the same public water fountain or things, and of course attending the same public schools as children. I want to talk more about microaggressions, everyday encounters that maintained the color line and reinforced the inequality that existed between white Southerners and their African American counterparts. Some of these examples included just walking in public streets, walking along the sidewalks. If African American Southerners were walking along a sidewalk down a street and a white Southerner was walking toward them in that direction, it was unspoken but very much expected that the African American individuals would yield the sidewalk, would step off the sidewalk and wait for the white person to pass them by before getting back onto the sidewalk and moving along their way. So that's an example of something small and not always noticeable to the casual observer, but it reinforced white supremacy in the South. Also, when black Southerners entered the homes of white Southerners, and this was usually primarily black women who worked as domestic workers. That was a major field of employment for black women in the post-Civil War era, especially post-Reconstruction era, and throughout the first half of the 20th century as well. Many of them became domestic workers, cleaning the homes, and in some cases acting as surrogate parents to the children of white families. But when they entered the home of their white employers, they were expected to enter through the back door of the house, not through the front entrance, because they weren't on that same equal social plane as their white counterparts. Another example of the social hierarchy being reinforced through Jim Crow segregation was when black people spoke to their white counterparts, they had to refer to whoever they were speaking to by title. So you would say Mr. Jones or Mrs. Smith or Dr. Brown or whatever the case may be, but he would never. They would never call their whoever their white conversationalist who they were speaking to, the subject of their conversation, I should say, they would never refer to them by their first name, the way that many people do in both casual and professional settings today. That just was something that was very much frowned upon during that era. And, these don't sound like major issues in and of themselves, but like I said, they were in place. These social customs were put into place to reinforce a social hierarchy in which whites were clearly at on a much higher plane than black Southerners, and any sort of deviation or violation of these social customs by African American Southerners would result in some form of punishment. Sometimes it would be, perhaps a slap in the face. Other times it might be a threat. Other times it might be something much more serious. There was no way to predict how a white person would react when a black person in the South dared to challenge them on these everyday customs. But the important thing to remember is that these were social customs that manifested themselves or occurred rather in daily lives, and they maintained the color line, reinforced white supremacy. In addition to these daily microaggressions, white Southerners did use the threat of violence to intimidate African Americans. We talked about that a little bit earlier in the semester in our discussion of the Black Codes and the founding of the Ku Klux Klan and the Night Riders and other vigilante groups in the 1860s and early 1870s. That returned in the 1890s with Jim Crow segregation, and the worst consequence imaginable for African Americans during this time was lynching. It was the most powerful form of domestic terrorism at the disposal of white Southerners during this era, and they could lynch black residents of the South for the smallest of crimes, or often just merely on suspicion of crime. There was very, very little evidence that was needed, because this was not something that was carried out as part of a sentence in a court ruling. This was an extra legal activity that occurred when a mob of white Southerners, or just a couple of individual white Southerners, decided to literally take matters into their own hands and kill a black Southerner or a group of black Southerners. These were very, very brutal killings. They weren't just simply a hanging or simply a shooting of a black Southerner, mostly African American men, but also there were plenty of African American women that were lynched during this time period. But they wanted to inflict maximum pain and maximum suffering to the victims during a lynching. So what might happen is before you hung the victim, you might mutilate the body in some way, shape, or form. Maybe you might, stab the body or try to remove a finger with a knife or something like that. You might shoot the individual, so that they would feel the pain of the gunshot before you killed them. Oftentimes, these individuals were burned alive. It was the most brutal type of death that you could imagine. And like I said, sometimes this was done for nothing more than suspicion of a crime, and even the legitimate disputes. These were often petty crimes, misdemeanor type crimes, or acts of defiance that resulted in the most brutal form of death imaginable. Lynching occurred primarily between 1880 and 1950 across the South. An estimated 5,000 African Americans lost their lives in this form of extralegal violence, and the final years of the 19th century represented the apex or the peak of lynching in the South, as on average 2 to 3 African Americans were lynched each week. The greatest number of recorded lynchings in the South from 1880 to 1930 occurred in the state of Mississippi. 500 plus, more than 500 black Mississippians were lynched during this time period. And Georgia was second only to Mississippi. More than 400 black Georgians were lynched during this time period. One of the major accusations that would result in a lynch mob revolved around sexual relationships between African American men and white women. White Southerners, above all else, would go to great lengths to protect the sanctity and purity of white women, and they would use that as justification for lynching. White Southerners did not approve, and in fact, they feared interracial relationships and miscegenation, which is a term that means when an interracial relationship produces a child, so a black woman and a white male, or a black male and a white woman. If there's a child that results from their relationship, that's obviously a mixed race or biracial child, and the white Southern establishment thought that this would result in the mongrelization of the white race. In other words, the white race would no longer be solely white, and it would be mixed and impure. That the purity of the white race was at stake here. And very prominent Southerners, as you can see in your textbook, American Yop, there were several prominent Southerners, leaders in the South, who justified lynching specifically on the grounds of preventing white women from African American men and sexual relationships with African American men. White women could accuse black men of raping them, and with little to no evidence, that was often all it took for a lynching. Also, white women that engaged in consensual sexual relationships with black men, if they were caught, they could claim that they were raped. And again, the black man was likely lynched or had to leave town quickly to avoid being lynched. But South Carolina Governor Coleman Bois kind of summed it up when he explained why he was okay with the fact that lynching denied the constitutional right of due process to black men. As he said, "Whenever the Constitution comes between me and the virtue of the white women of South Carolina, I say to hell with the Constitution." Think about that. To hell with the Constitution. Just to justify an interracial relationship that, might not exist in the first place and might actually be consensual. These were times where, in short, throughout the South, they were far more likely to lynch first before really getting the facts of the story. I mentioned at the top of our lecture today that that lynchings in the South during this time were often very public spectacles. People found out about it in advance. They would show up and watch it. Vendors would sell items, food and other items, and it was essentially like going to any popular event that contemporary Americans might go to, a sporting event or a concert or a fair or festival. Like, that's lynchings occupied that same sort of status throughout much of the South during this era. And oftentimes there were pictures taken of the crowds watching a lynching, and those were preserved, many times put on postcards that attendees could have as a keepsake or send to a relative, and things like that to sort of prove that they were there. And if you look in the upper left-hand corner of this slide, this is a crowd at a public lynching in the South, and there you can see the victim is hanging by a noose from the big tree in the middle of the picture. So that was lynching. It was a major part of extra-legal justice, if you will, in the South during that time, and it's one of the most horrible things that occurred with shocking regularity in our region's history. So, moving on, I now want to talk about exactly how African Americans in the South fought back against lynching to the extent that they could. It was often led by black women. Black women formed clubs during these final decades of the 19th century. These clubs consisted primarily of middle-class black women, and they would provide social services for less fortunate African Americans within their communities, people like the elderly, the infirmed, the poor, the orphaned, and try to help them and aid them in any way they could. Eventually, this led to the formation of a group called the National Association of Colored Women in 1896. And in addition to assisting the weaker members of their own communities, they fought to eliminate racism and segregation as best as they could during this era. Either on Friday's lecture or perhaps next Monday's lecture, one of the two, we will discuss the white equivalent of these women's social clubs, because it was something that was prevalent amongst middle-class white women during this same time period. But the National Association of Colored Women, founded in 1896, and this group did whatever they could to help their communities, up to and including combating racism and segregation. By far the most prominent individual to attack lynching during this era was Ida B. Wells. Wells was born to a slave family in 1862 in Mississippi. She eventually settled in Memphis and boldly challenged Jim Crow segregation after she was denied a seat in a railroad car in Tennessee in the 1880s. She filed a discrimination suit and actually won at the circuit court level. However, the Tennessee Supreme Court ultimately overturned the lower court that ruled in favor of Wells. So her victory was short-lived, as the Tennessee Supreme Court decided that they needed to reinforce Jim Crow segregation laws from a legal standpoint. After this defeat, Wells makes a commitment to challenge racism. She becomes a journalist and worked as the editor of the Memphis Free Speech. That was an African-American newspaper in the 1890s. In 1892, 3 of her friends, all black men, were lynched by a white mob, and that inspired her to fight back using her words. She wrote a book called Southern Horrors: Lynch Law in All Its Phases. It was a book that attacked lynching and white supremacy. And in that book, she specifically challenged claims that white women were being raped by black men. She basically argued that there was little to no evidence that this was taking place in any sort of widespread manner during this time period, and that white Southerners, particularly white men, were using that as a crutch to inflict violence and lynch black men because they wanted to. As you can imagine, Wells's writings did not go over well within the white community. In fact, it enraged white Southerners of this time period, and she herself became a target for violence and for lynching. However, she fled Memphis and relocated to New York City, and continued to be an outspoken critic of Jim Crow laws and white supremacy from New York. Continued to write, continued to work in the very fledgling civil rights activism that was taking place in the Northeast at the time, in the early part of the 20th century. If you take a look in the upper left-hand corner of this slide, you can see a picture of Ida B. Wells, perhaps the most prominent picture of her during her life. But you can also still attain a copy of Southern Horrors. It's a short book, but it is a very powerful book if you are perhaps interested in further reading and learning more about Ida B. Wells and specifically about how the way she challenged lynching and Jim Crow segregation in the South during this time period. Well, that was a look at the activism of black women and how they fought to, as best as they could, to challenge Jim Crow laws in the region. On the other side, the white community did everything they could to enhance Jim Crow in the South, and perhaps the most powerful manner in which they did so was by creating and championing a narrative known as the lost cause. During the 1890s, as Southern state politicians began to implement Jim Crow laws across the South, white Southerners across the region embraced the lost cause. What is the lost cause exactly? Well, in the words of Charles Reagan Wilson, who spent many years as a history professor right here at the University of Mississippi, he retired in 2014. He wrote the definitive book on the origins of the lost cause, and he describes it as a civic religion. It was a narrative which lionized the Confederacy and the soldiers that fought to defend it in the Civil War. And basically the way it worked was proponents of this narrative spread the idea that the decision to secede from the Union that the Southern states, one by one, proceeded to do in 1861, and the Civil War itself, was not because of slavery. Slavery, they argued, was not the primary reason for secession or for going to war with the Union. Rather, they argued that the Confederate soldiers fought to defend their homes and their honor against an aggressive Union force coming in from the North. This is false, it should be noted. There are numerous primary source documents and evidence from personal correspondence of white Southerners during that time period, as well as public speeches by Southern politicians, including Alexander Stephens, who was the vice president of the Confederacy, and also in the opening lines of the individual state declarations of secession, including Mississippi's Declaration of Secession, it makes it very clear that slavery and the defense of slavery as a economic and social system in the South was the reason that the Confederacy was formed, and that it was why the Southerners fought vigorously to defend the Confederacy. But that's not how the Lost Cause characterized things. Beyond just the causes of the Civil War and the reasons for fighting, the Lost Cause narrative also offered up an idyllic vision of the antebellum South, the South of the first half of the 19th century before the outbreak of the Civil War. They portrayed the antebellum South of the Lost Cause advocates portrayed the antebellum South as an idealized society in which African Americans worked happily in service of their masters. The masters were benevolent individuals, and the slaves were happy to work for them. That was how the Lost Cause advocates made the argument and presented the vision of the South during this time period. Basically, the Lost Cause narrative was designed to whitewash the atrocities of slavery and the problematic state of race relations in the South. Remember, the Lost Cause really comes to fruition in the 1890s. That's shortly after Henry W. Grady wrote those editorials and delivered the speeches in the North promoting the idea of the New South, and that the South, as he argued, the New South was not like the Old South of the pre-Civil War era. And the Lost Cause took it a step further and basically argued that the pre-Civil War era in the South was really not all that bad, which of course was false, but that was the narrative that they pushed forward, and they, as well as the cause of the Civil War, pushing forward that they were just in fighting for the Civil War, and that it was not a war fought to keep human beings in bondage, when in fact that's clearly what their cause was. Social groups and politicians worked tirelessly to promote the Lost Cause throughout the final decade of the 19th century, and especially in the first couple of decades of the 20th century, and beyond that. But they were most active from the period between the late 1880s through the late 1920s, early 1930s. Groups such as the United Daughters of the Confederacy, for example, raised funds to build statues honoring Confederate soldiers in the public squares of cities and towns throughout the South. Many of these statues were located on or adjacent to the grounds of the local courthouses. If you followed the news closely in the last several years, you know that a lot of those Civil War, or I should say Confederate monuments that were erected in the 1890s and the 1900s and 1910s have come under attack as vestiges of white supremacy, and in many communities they have come down. In New Orleans, for example, Mayor Mitch Landrieu led an effort to remove the Civil War monuments in that city. Here in Oxford, there was a great deal of controversy surrounding the Civil War monument on campus that was located at the base of the circle, right in front of the Lyceum. There was question of whether it should be removed and out of public view entirely, or if it should just be removed to a less conspicuous, less prominent place on campus where it would be viewed by fewer students, alumni, and visitors. And in fact, that was what happened. As you may be aware, the Confederate monument here on the University of Mississippi campus, which I believe was originally erected in 1906, was relocated to the Confederate cemetery on campus, which is in the area, I believe, behind or beyond the Tad Smith Coliseum. It's still there. It's still available for public viewing, but it is in a much, much less conspicuous part of campus. It's not one of the first things people see when they enter the campus from the South Lamar and the square and that area. But you may be aware, I'm sure you probably are aware, that the monument, the Confederate monument in Oxford off campus is still at the base of the square, right in the center of the courthouse square. The picture in the upper right-hand corner is a picture from the Oxford Eagle of that monument in front of the Oxford courthouse, the Lafayette County Courthouse, I should say. Beyond monuments, politicians also worked to maintain the Lost Cause, advancing the Lost Cause by creating symbols or events that honored the Confederacy. For example, in the 1890s, the state legislators voting in the state legislature created the former Mississippi state flag. It was created in I think 1894. I might be off by a year, but it was in the 1890s. and lasted until this past summer of 2020. It was the flag that contained the Confederate battle flag emblem in the upper left-hand corner. That was an example of Confederate iconography that was designed to advance the lost cause, that was put into place by politicians. And they did other things such as establish state holidays such as Confederate Memorial Day, again, that it advances the lost cause. And basically all of these things taken together, the construction and erection of Confederate monuments, as well as the symbols such as the battle flag within the state flag, and state holidays such as Confederate Memorial Day, or in some cases Robert E. Lee's birthday, which became a popular state holiday in certain southern states after Martin Luther King Jr.'s holiday became a federal holiday back in the 80s. These are all examples that not only praise the Confederacy, but they're designed to reinforce white supremacy. These monuments were not constructed 3 years, 5 years, even 10 years after the Civil War ended, but rather 25, 30, 35 years and later. And that was because the people that were behind the efforts to get these things established, created, and in the public eye wanted to cement Jim Crow segregation as the political and social custom of the South, the sort of unwritten, and in the case of the legal laws, written way of life in the South, with a hierarchy designed to keep African Americans at the bottom or considerably below their white counterparts. So I want to finish up today's lecture by discussing two of the prominent African American public intellectuals that emerged during the 1890s and the turn of the 20th century. These men are Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. Very accomplished men individually. Both of them were educators and professors at the collegiate level, and yet they had very, very different views on how Americans could advance in society and the methods that African Americans should take to advance in society. So I'll start by talking about Booker T. Washington. Washington was the son of a slave. He was the product of an interracial relationship between a white man and a black woman. He was educated at Hampton Institute, which is now known as Hampton University. It's an HBCU in Virginia. And he was then hired to be the principal of Tuskegee Normal School, which he expanded the campus, raised funds to expand the campus, and create a 4-year college there, and transition from just a K through 12 school into a college campus, and it became known as Tuskegee Institute. It's now known today, as it still exists, as Tuskegee University. It is a private HBCU located in the state of Alabama. Washington presided as the president of Tuskegee Institute from the 1880s until his death in 1915, and he promoted vocational and industrial education at the school in order to prepare black students for the jobs that were available to African Americans in the South during this era. So we're talking about jobs like farming and skilled labor and trade jobs. and then also sort of more of your middle class white professional jobs, such as teaching in the black public schools, the segregated schools that were set aside for the South's black children to take classes and earn their elementary and secondary school education. And Tuskegee was a college that would train teachers for jobs in those schools. Washington's basic philosophy was that African Americans should concentrate on themselves, look within, and try to build a successful career within the black community in those fields that I mentioned that Tuskegee really focused on, and to avoid pushing for an integrated society with blacks and whites on equal ground politically and socially. He believed that if African Americans continued to push for equality with their white counterparts, that it would only serve to antagonize white Southerners, and who would retaliate through violence and perhaps retaliate economically as well. He felt that if African Americans would just work to build their own successful communities independent of white communities, that perhaps they would earn the respect of white Southerners, and that they would possibly receive funding from the white communities, particularly for public schools and colleges and universities. And he himself raised money for Tuskegee from wealthy white Americans, particularly outside of the South. Some of the robber barons, such as John D. Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie, gave money to Washington for Tuskegee during this time. Washington presented his viewpoint and his philosophy as an argument in a speech that he delivered at the Cotton States and International Exposition in Atlanta in 1895. That was one of those industrial fairs that I talked about on Monday's lecture, that Henry W. Grady pushed for the city of Atlanta in his efforts to advance Atlanta and the South through the New South and bring industrialization to the South. Washington was at one of these fairs in 1895, gave his basic philosophy in a speech, and ultimately that speech became known as, it earned the label as the Atlanta Compromise. W.E.B. Du Bois also was a very accomplished academic within the black community during this same time period of the turn of the 20th century. Du Bois had been raised in Massachusetts, and he came to the South for his college education. He attended Fisk University in Nashville and HBCU, and he encountered racism for the first time during his undergraduate years at Fisk University. After he graduated from Fisk, Du Bois enrolled in graduate school at Harvard, and he became the very first African American to earn a doctorate at the Ivy League school. Du Bois earned his doctorate in history, and following his receipt of the PhD, he began a career as a professor at Atlanta University, now today known as Clark Atlanta University, and HBCU in Atlanta. And in 1909, he co-founded the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. With regard to Washington, Du Bois vehemently disagreed with Washington's vision for African American advancement, and he publicly attacked it. He argued that African Americans needed to strive for white-collar jobs, but white-collar jobs in an integrated society. He understood that there would always be a need for industrial labor within the rural South, and that black Southerners could be trained for those types of jobs and earn their living that way. But Du Bois believed that the best and brightest, if you will, of African Americans, a group that he called the talented 10th, the top 10% academically, could only gain equality for the entire race by ascending to elite professional jobs in which they would work with college-educated white colleagues. In fact, he thought that Washington's argument and Washington's position was so weak that he described the Atlanta Compromise, his reaction to the Atlanta Compromise, as with the following statement: "We refuse to surrender the leadership of this race to cowards." It's about as strong a public rebuke as you can possibly imagine. But that was W.E.B. Du Bois. That's how strongly he felt that Washington was doing more harm than good by promoting what he viewed as a continuation of a segregation within the South. If you take a look in the upper right-hand corner of the slide here, that is Du Bois and Washington side by side. Washington is in the far right there, and Du Bois is in the left, the man with the quite fashionable handlebar mustache and goatee. That is W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington. Washington died in 1915 at the age of 59, died rather suddenly while he was still working as the president of Tuskegee Institute. Du Bois wound up living a very long life. He didn't die until the early 1960s, and he was 95 years old at the time of his death. Wrote many, many books, and continued to speak and teach and be a public intellectual throughout his life. That wraps up today's lecture. When we talk again on Friday, we'll get into some of the labor issues within the industrial American society that unfolded in the 1880s and the 1890s. But I kind of wanted to give you a further exploration of the Jim Crow South and everything that involved socially, as well as with how African Americans tried to overcome the challenges they faced during this era. So I will speak to you again on Friday. Don't forget to take a look at the primary source analysis assignment on Blackboard or in the email that I sent you today. And that assignment is due on Thursday, February 18th via SafeAssign.